Thank you. This is just to let council know that we are the review committee, which was Mr. Esborn, myself, Councilman, Law Director Lieberman, Ruth Boer. We all met, and the mayor, and we all met to review the qualification statements that had come in, and we picked two different firms one to do the comprehensive land use plan update and another one to do the planning and zoning code update. We're having a telephone conference with the two of them and going to be talking about scope of services, so we will be bringing more information forward with them with some price proposals to move forward with this. But we will be using two different firms for this. One was by far, as we all discussed it and did the interviews last week, one by far stood out as far as being very well suited for our needs for the comprehensive land use update. So we're anxious to get that started. And then once that gets started, the other firm has a very good background in planning and zoning code writing. So we'll be bringing that forward to Planning Commission and bringing it forward to council, because we will need to authorize the mayor to enter into these contracts. So we'll give you some more information as we work on the complete scope of services with these two firms. But tomorrow is when we are all meeting to actually have a discussion with them to further define what we want to have them included in there. And because we're having two firms, we're basically going to do a telephone conference and bring the two firms together for a discussion. So I'm very pleased that we all came to a unanimous choice on both of these firms as we move forward. And quite honestly, when we got done with the interviews, we sat down there for a very short period of time and said, yes, we like this one, we like this one. So we're bringing that forward, and I'll give council as well as planning commission and zoning board an update as this moves forward. But we're moving in a positive direction here. So
what timeline are you looking at in terms of?
I'll be able to tell you more
okay.
Next week for sure, as far as timelines go, because how quickly they're able to work together with the law department to actually put together some contracts and define the scopes. We'll know a little bit more about that tomorrow, because I don't believe in talking to each of the firms separately, they have not worked together. So we want to make sure that we all know what we're gonna expect from each one of the two.
Okay.
But time frame wise, I think we're talking 12 to 18 months for this process to go forward. And then, like I said, with the two firms, get the planning and zoning comprehensive land use plan started, and then turn that into the planning and zoning code update.
Questions dealing with the planning and zoning code land use rewrite. Mrs. Fenderbosh.
Thank you. Mr. Reitz, would you go into a little bit of detail for some of the other council members and also for the public as to why the decision was made not to just change a few of the planning and zoning codes, and why do a complete overrun or a complete redo?
Mr. Reitz.
Well, particularly with the planning and zoning code, there's been so many issues with certain sections of that have run through reviews by planning commission and zoning board, the zoning administrator having some major concerns, and there's so many sections that needed update. It was just decided that we would like to start over again with a complete new look on the planning and zoning code. And then conversely, the comprehensive land use plan, there's been so many things that have gone on since that was really looked at with a new set of eyes. We start anew with the planning comprehensive land use plan, which involves things such as the master thoroughfare plan and the master bicycle plan. We've done all those studies over the years. When we did the multimodal transportation plan several years ago with NOACA funds, we were involved with the county when they were looking at the lakefront. So taking these various studies, put them together, and then looking at the city and how we've created the current land use that we have, and then just basically, add in the West End Development Group's work that was, very thoroughly discussed, and come up with a completely new comprehensive land use plan.
Mr. Koss.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Council President. Joe, a couple of questions regarding the planning and zoning code. rewrite. You know, the code is very thorough. It's been around for a long time, and there's parts of it that obviously need to be updated and replaced, but there's other parts of it that seem to work very well. Is this firm that the city's looking to hire going to keep some of the things that work very well, that are written well, that still function well? Or is this an idea that we're going to go into each code section and rewrite it, whether it needs to be or not? It seems like there's a lot of stuff in there, and some stuff does need to be changed, but other stuff in there seems to be working very well. The city's done very well under the current code. It can do better with improvements, but what's the thoughts of that? And I have a second one when Abe's done.
Mr. Lieberman?
Yeah, Dave, Ruth and I discussed this at length, and we've, of probably anybody in the administration, we've dealt the most with the planning and zoning code. And the problem with doing, this has gotten amended and changed, and it's gotten to the point where it no longer really fits together anymore. I mean, it's much harder, we think, to try and retrofit and do a correction of sections that we think are okay. They still won't flow, they still won't fit, it still won't be a modern code. So the thought was it would be much easier, it would lead to a much more user-friendly code if we just started from scratch and just had a good, cohesive, workable code. There's a lot of problems with the way the code currently exists that we encounter on a daily basis in terms of organization, in terms of substance, and it just seemed that we needed a whole new approach. And quite frankly, it's much easier to do it that way than it is to try and fit a square peg into a round hole, and it's just time.
Ms. Rice, do you have anything else to add to that? Or?
No.
Okay. Next question. Go ahead, Mr.
Another question is, this just came to me. It seems like this is a big project. Are there any other communities that we can look to that have done something similar to this, where they've restarted the whole thing over?
Mr. Lieberman?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there were communities that this particular, the company that we're looking at did, and that was one of the things we were impressed with when Ruth and I looked at it, and I think the rest of the people in the that were listening to the presentations looked at these codes. They read very well, they were well organized, they were modern, and they just seemed to not to have some of the problems we've been encountering on a daily basis with the use of the code that we currently have.
Scott?
Yep, and the last thing I have is there any plans to reach out to the community, the business community, and get their suggestions and opinions on what should be included in this proposed rewrite?
Mr. Lieberman?
There are two things we looked at, and one is basically the comprehensive land use plan, where we felt that initial community input was important. Okay, there will be some community input in terms of the planning and zoning code, but they're two very different animals. The planning and zoning code, we felt, was somebody sitting in a room and basically drafting a comprehensive piece of legislation. That's not to say that community input isn't, important, but it's not something that can be done by committee. It just becomes a total disaster if it's done that way. It's somebody locking themselves in a room with peace and quiet and creating something that flows, that's comprehensive, and then once it's done, then we can look at it and see if there's any issues that we have. But I think at the beginning, having it's just something that cannot be done by committee. Whereas on the other hand, the comprehensive land use plan really invites community input from the outset.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any further questions? There.
Thank you. It was suggested that by starting over, it'd be like building a house, Mr. Cost, from scratch, rather than taking an old house and remodeling the kitchen and the bathrooms, et cetera, you would just get a better product, a more streamlined and up-to-date product without as much effort, because when you tried to replace bits and pieces, you've got a lot of work to do that you don't anticipate, and that resonated with the committee. And Mr. Lieberman normally is not a passionate man, but both he and Mrs. Boer spoke very strongly about the weaknesses in our current code and suggested that it could be rewritten where it would flow better and it would be up to date in many ways. Times have changed since the middle 90s. So, one thing I did learn is we had between 23 and 25 people on the initial committee in the mid 90s, and a majority of them were residents, which sounds good and noble, but when you're writing a code, you need professionals to do that because they understand the subtleties of and the nuances of certain words with regard to application of certain standards. We are going to periodically bring the document out and share it with the community and ask for input, and then the persons writing the code will go back to work, make adjustments as they sense are needed based on the input they've had, bring it out again, have that same process occur. So they will be part of the review process, but in a more passive way rather than sincere citizens being involved actually in writing standards, which doesn't always work very well. So I think we had 3 of the 4 were truly very, very impressive. And Mr. Lieberman and Mrs. Boer both picked the one particular firm for writing the code, and we all were very impressed with them. And then with the land use plan, we have another group that was talking about autonomous vehicles, and when you apply that to our parking lot requirements, etc., they were looking to the future. And we did have a firm in that had written the previous code, and they were talking about the past. It was very obvious that we need to write our code to anticipate the next 20 years, not bring it up to 2018, but to take it beyond 2018 to anticipate changes that will be taking place in our society, which are going to dramatically change land use.
Thank you, Mayor. Ms. Vanderbilt.
Final question for the mayor. Mr. Zilka, do you foresee the personnel city organizational chart changing as a result of a rewrite of the planning and zoning code? Would the departments change? For example, right now our code states that we have a city architect, we have a city planner, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have those seats filled in this office.
Mayor.
I'm sure that will be those 2 areas will be points of a great deal of discussion. We're at a point where we're starting to fill out, but the final pieces of that puzzle are very difficult because we're trying to squeeze in between 2 developments in some cases, and the developer, of course, wanting to maximize his or her profit. At the same time, the impact on the adjoining subdivisions or plan unit developments already there, that becomes very difficult and cumbersome and awkward. And I think we began to see some of that when we looked at the old horse farm on Krebs Road. That was some of the problem there. That probably will be up for discussion. I lived in an era where we did have a couple of city planners, and we moved away from that. And there were various reasons for that. Sometimes it's a personality thing. Sometimes you have exceptional people, and then other times the individuals have differences of opinion where it doesn't work as smoothly. So that will be fair game, Mrs. Vanderbosch.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Thank you, Mr. Royce.
Okay.
Go to third read.
I have that.
Oh,
I
I'm
have
sorry.
comments. I have a lot of comments on this.
Go ahead, Mr. Lieber.
I was going to have this put on because I had gotten feedback on this in the public arena from people. So I called Valerie last week to have her put it on. She said it's already on, and when I had gotten feedback from people in the community on it. I talked to Joe, and I got a copy of the RFP that went out, and I'd like to get a copy of whatever the city has received from the firms that they've chose. I guess my concern is you have a land use plan that was written. It calls for an update every 5 years. Why aren't we just doing a 5-year update on it? We can have it be a little bit more detailed, but you have a town that is 85-90% built, and now you're going to rewrite the whole comprehensive plan when there's hardly any land left to develop. That's a concern that I really have. The other concern I have is the cost. How much does this cost? I mean, the last land use plan we wrote was $100,000, I believe. Is this a budgeted amount? Where is it budgeted at? How much do we expect it to be? Those are the concerns I have. I think that public input in this process is the most important. The most important. We sat in I believe it was 95. It was probably over that long period of time. You're talking 18 months to do this. We had meeting after meeting on this, got a lot of different feedback on it. But I just have several concerns about this in my own mind. The cost of it, why we're doing it when we have a town that's almost virtually built out. I mean, there are a few sections of property still left to be built, but they're all 1A. I can see there's certain areas of town that we want to look at. The West End, we need to have discussions on what we're going to be doing with Town Center. But we've always run into problems when people are hooking up into streets that were dead-end streets. That's been something that's been going on. I guess my concern is that you're going to you rewrite a whole. You're not just doing the land use plan, but you're writing the whole planning and zoning code in something that already does exist, has basically worked well with the city on something that's worked well with the city, number one, but on a community that's almost built out. I can understand if we want to do something in addition, or to add to it, or to make changes in it, but to throw out these 3 things to me is of concern when you already have something there that's worked pretty well. And I'm just going to share my concerns here in the beginning, but I think that getting public feedback, especially from the people that use the planning and zoning code on a daily basis within the community, and so that they can have some understanding if we're going to go forward on this. And I would really like the question answered on what we have budgeted for this and where that budget amount is.
Thank you. All 4 of the firms that came in to meet with this strongly pointed out very strongly that the land use plan for 1995 no longer fits a land use plan that has a highway with another intersection. Close your eyes and imagine what was along I-90 in 1995. Virtually nothing. The amount of business zoned areas that we have is well beyond which will work. It just won't work anymore, and we have to reassess those. So that's an important part of this. We will be soliciting input from the public, from developers, from residents, etc. It's just that we won't have them on the committee, involved in the writing, involved in the weekly or monthly commentary. They will be periodically presented with information, and we will welcome their comments. We're not trying to block those people out. With regard to the budgeting, we failed to put it in the 2018 budget, but we went to Mr. Presley and we talked about finding approximately $100,000 for 2018, which should more than cover it, but this will fall over into 2019, which we will have to put in another amount. Once we get that far in the process, we'll know about how much that is. So it could be 100, 150,000. Maybe it will be higher than that, but we do have the resources in order to accomplish this, and it is going to be less problems for us and the people who follow us in these positions if we redo the code, make it more efficient, make it more up-to-date, taking into consideration modern technology, etc. So we feel very strongly that the land use plan has to be reevaluated. Our perception of how much parking we needed, Town Center is a classic example, we really missed on that, and frankly the developers were right on that based in retrospect. We do have Town Center with these large that large parking lot, and it doesn't lend itself to the flow and convenience of that property, so perhaps that whole area can be redone, including other types of land use in that area to mix it with commercial, perhaps with residential and so forth, which will make it a viable or more viable area. What we did in '95 expected that the old town shopping center was going to be a viable economic unit. It has been challenged over the last decade or so. We feel that the recreation facility that's going to be open in there shortly is going to be a big economic boost for that area. We're confident that that's going to be the case. That is very close to the West End. We will have an opportunity to review the study that we did several years ago, and the group that is going to do the land use plan will suggest and how we can incorporate that into it. We've been trying to buy up property within the West End and also working with First Energy to create a block of property which can be marketable. And once we do that, then we may well have the opportunity to market that property and find people who might be interested in developing that in a commercial way and possibly combined with some element of housing, etc. So we're going to be nimble and flexible here, and we're going to be given suggestions by the firm that's going to help us. But it's going to be the community, including the residents, are going to have an input here on how this turns out. There's no question about it. So I think I answered most of your questions, sir.
Schools have asked me to do the kindergarten registration open school year 2018-2019 is now going on. You can visit the Avon Lake School website, which is www.avonlakecityschools.org.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Council President. I want to take a moment and congratulate my colleague, the Ward 1 City Councilman, Rob James. Last week he completed his first marathon. He ran it with his wife, Laura. 26.2 miles. He survived it all, and immediately he went straight to Disney World because it was at Disney World. So 26.2 miles it's no joke. It's unforgiving, and it takes a lot of dedication and a lot of stubbornness to train for that and run it. So Rob, congratulations.
Congratulations. Mrs. Federbosh.
Thank you. I received a text from Paul Orlowski, who lives in Ward 2, and he wanted to congratulate and thank Joe Wrights. He was unable to make it to this meeting because he was called on a job site, but he wanted to thank Joe Wrights and the rest of the service department for taking care of the roads here in Avon Lake during the past snowstorms that we have experienced. Having traveled through a number of communities, he says in his note, he says it was always a pleasure to come back home where they were clear. Thank you.
Thank you.